Good evening and welcome, listeners, to Cafe de Flore. Cafe de Flore is a server dedicated to education and debate where we discuss issues in philosophy, politics, the sciences, and the arts. My name is Shiny, and I'm joined tonight by leftist content creators Pogan and Socialism on the Left, who will be debating the question of whether leftists should support gun control. A recording of tonight's debate will eventually be hosted on the Cafe de Flore YouTube channel, a link to which can be found on my Twitter, twitter.com/shinybaboon, where I also post announcements about upcoming events. But anyway, with all that being said, let's introduce the debaters. So, Socialism Done Left is a reformist democratic socialist who will be arguing in favor of gun control. He has a BS in economics. He co-hosts the evidence-based leftism podcast with Malfi Infidel. And some of you might also remember him from our Noam Chomsky AMA back in December, which he actually co-hosted. You can find him at Socialism Done Left on YouTube and at Sock Done Left on Twitter and Twitch. SDL, thanks so much for being here. If you want to add anything to the introduction I just gave, feel free to do so now.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. I'm based. Okay, follow me.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. So we'll move on to Pogan now. Pogan is a revolutionary Marxist who will be arguing against gun control. He's made video essays on a wide range of political and academic topics, and he once took part in an infamous debate about the rationality of theism against a certain Quinian philosopher who shall, for purposes, remain nameless. You can find him at Pogan on YouTube and at Poganist on Twitter and Twitch. Pogan, thank you so much for being here, and if you want to add anything to your introduction, you could do so now.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for having me. Follow me. I'm also based.
Okay, thank you, Pogan. So before we start, I'll briefly explain the structure of the debate for the benefit of the audience. So first, each debater is going to have 5 uninterrupted minutes to deliver an opening statement, though they aren't required to use up the whole 5 minutes. They can yield the remainder of their time if they finish early. And then the opening statements will be followed up by about an hour of open discussion, where I'll only be stepping in to resolve any real impasses in the conversation, such as cases of excessive overtalking. So after the open discussion segment's concluded, each debater will have 5 minutes for closing remarks, and then we'll go into a Q&A if the debaters are up for it. So with that out of the way, are you guys ready to begin?
Yes.
SDL,
Sure.
ready? All right. Are you guys okay with SDL going first since he's defending gun control?
Sure.
All right. SDL, during the timer, whenever you start talking, you have 5 minutes.
Sure, I'm probably not going to take the full time. So the basic argument for gun control, in my opinion, breaks down to the public health gains and harms of gun control, and then whether there is like a political aspect of gun control. So first, the public health positives of gun control and therefore negatives of like widespread household civilian gun ownership. Basically, there's a lot of evidence. It's not unanimous, but there is a high degree of expert agreement that guns seem to be linked very strongly to suicide. For example, there was a recent study that found that having a handgun in your house that you purchased in California increased the risk of suicide by handgun by about like 3 times, something along those lines. And I think overall suicide by like 2 times. That many studies find similar links. And so that link is very hard to dispute. The homicide link is somewhat more questionable, just mostly because it's harder to measure that, and homicide is caused by many other things that are less directly linked to weapons. But there too, there's a high degree of evidence that more gun ownership generally tends to not increase the rate of violent crime per se, but it seems to convert violent crime to homicide, is I think the strongest case to be made. For example, there's a stunning stat to me anyway, that it's hard to do international comparisons of crime rates across countries because different countries have different definitions of crime. But one way of doing so that's reasonably accurate is called victim surveys. So a while ago, back in 2011, the UN did a victim survey of the United States and of many other countries in the OECD, so rich countries. And they found that roughly the same portion of people reported being the victims of violent crime in many of these rich countries. However, the United States was unique in that its homicide rate was 3 to 6 times higher than these other rich countries. So it doesn't seem to be the case that the United States is this weirdly, uniquely violent country. Instead, it's that our violence is homicidal. And that means that there is an even larger negative impact of crime than in other countries. And so, whatever you think of the U.S. carceral state, whatever you think of solutions to crime, we can't eliminate it. No country can eliminate it. So long as crime exists, so long as violent crime exists, guns seem to increase the violence of that crime. And it's worth noting that within gun homicide, a significant portion of that, even if you imagine that you got rid of like gang violence and interpersonal violence, something like a third of that is domestic violence. And again, there's a lot of strong evidence there that laws specifically about taking guns away from those who've done domestic violence reduces the risk of future domestic homicide. So in short, there's a lot of evidence that guns destroy, in my opinion, or hurt public health because they increase suicide, they increase homicide, both in general, like interpersonal, and also in the home, domestically. Then on the positives, I just don't think there's very much evidence that guns help self-defense. That's something we can debate about in this, but I don't think the evidence on that is very strong. And at best, I think the case would be that it's a wash. So guns protect you as much as they hurt you. And at worst, I think there's a lot of evidence that they hurt you. And the only other benefits of guns seem to be psychological, that, hey, maybe it makes you happy to go shoot stuff up. So that's a very weak benefit, as opposed to the estimated something like $150 to $220 billion economic loss from deaths and injuries that guns cause. So in short, big public health negative. The only remaining argument, in my opinion, is the political one. Maybe guns give workers power. Maybe guns give average people power. On this one, again, I just don't think there's a lot of strong evidence. I think maybe this was true in the 1900s when states were weaker and people were poorer. Nowadays, workers have a lot more to lose than just their chains. Most people aren't willing to be radical. Most people aren't willing to be violent. In fact, there's evidence that nonviolent movements are more successful than violent ones. So it's not entirely clear that we should want to encourage violent movements rather than more successful nonviolent organizing. I think, in short, the arguments for why that's the case and why that might have changed from when Lenin and Marx might have been writing is, in short, that people are richer now, they don't want to revolt, and the state is so much stronger and so much more centralized than back then.
All right, is that it?
I guess the summary then, it hurts public health, doesn't seem to help workers.
Okay, thank you for the opening statement, STL. Pogan, you have 5 minutes whenever you're ready.
Sure. So I want to quickly thank SDL for agreeing and Shiny for moderating. The topic concerns the stance leftists should have regarding gun control, and that's something I consider to be a foundational tenet of revolutionary ideology. So over the course of the last 200 years, the vast majority of leftist movements, Marxist-inspired and otherwise, have been ones utilizing force and firearms to achieve their political goals. These movements include the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Communist Revolution, the establishment of the French Commune, the Vietnam War, and the Nepalese Civil War, all of which were successful in the sense that communists achieved one or all of their immediate political goals through the use of force. Even non-leftist political movements have typically required the use of force to gain ground, ranging from events like the American and French revolutions to the seizure of the Reichstag by the Nazis, who coincidentally primarily used force and firearms as a means of suppressing their main opposition, the Communist Party of Germany. There's clearly precedent for political movements of all kinds employing force as a way of actualizing their desires, and as such, the socialist movement must be prepared to respond in kind, especially since we can cite historical precedent for the bourgeois using force initially. We can cite a myriad of historical incidents and events that demonstrate without question that the bourgeois and their thugs are ready and able to utilize force as a means of suppressing worker movements of all kinds should those movements pose any meaningful threat to their rule. This can be observed on the largest scale, sweeping revolutions like the October Revolution, to the smallest scale, Amazon workers attempting to unionize and being intimidated and threatened with police action on the orders of Amazon. In prior conversations concerning gun control, SDL has frequently cited empirical studies regarding violent crime and suicide rates as a way of suggesting that we ought legislate firearm ownership for the purpose of reducing such social harms. It's virtually undeniable that firearm access is correlated with these things, as they would be in any society where citizens feel compelled to commit crime or take their own lives. But as socialists, we must consider if our priority is to legislate these issues within the current system, excusing the fact that a majority of violent crimes are financial in nature and thus exacerbated by the oppressive forces of capitalism, or if our priority is to eliminate this system and establish socialism. I would hope that my opponent shares this goal, and therefore our fundamental disagreement will not be on gun ownership within the current bourgeois system, but rather whether or not restricting worker ownership of firearms is conducive or harmful to providing them with power and eventually abolishing capitalism. All of the major Marxist thinkers of the 20th century firmly held the stance that revolution, not reform, would be necessary to achieving socialism. All of them believed that worker ownership of firearms was a necessary condition to the actualization of that goal. They recognized that violence was inevitable, and as such, removal of firearms only served to provide capitalists with even more power and control. This stance of workers owning firearms to use against the bourgeois if such circumstances required, of course, has a basis in theory. In his March 1850 address to the Communist League, Marx stated, "Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary." Other leftist thinkers, including Mao, Lenin, and Engels, shared this sentiment. To quote Lenin, "Only an armed people can be the real bulwark of popular liberty." To quote Mao, "Every communist must grasp the truth that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." In accordance with these statements, each of these men obviously led violent revolutions that, at minimum, achieved their immediate political goals. My opponent is a reformist, which means that he doesn't believe revolution is a prerequisite for the successful establishment of socialism. He instead believes that through policy changes and legislation, we can gradually reach socialism in the existing capitalist society. I contend that this is a weak stance. Let's discuss the case for capitalists arming and financing opposition parties. In the Weimar Republic, when presented with the threat of a looming socialist movement, the capitalists provided assistance to the fascists, who then utilized force as a way of suppressing the communists before establishing themselves as the dominant party. In the US, numerous Marxist movements, such as the Black Panthers, have been continuously suppressed and spied on by agents of the US government, even absent the realistic threat of socialism being achieved. When mere progressive liberals, such as Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, attempt to acquire power in bourgeois societies, they are publicly ridiculed and subjected to the forces of collusion among existing power apparatuses as a way of stripping them of any chance they had at acquiring a role of authority. Politicians that do publicly proclaim themselves to be socialist, such as AOC, often buckle under these pressures and become welfare capitalists in function. Being opposed to gun control also serves as a political tool in and of itself. One of the central issues on the right is gun ownership. That is, right-wingers almost universally are opposed to government measures that restrict private ownership of firearms. As such, taking a firm stance against gun control can serve as a way of ingratiating right-wingers into the socialist cause. My opponent may be inclined to suggest that the same case could be made for other policies, such as being opposed to immigration, but this is disanalogous. Such positions that the right advocates for would be starkly opposed to the overall socialist mission, while gun control isn't. As has been elaborated upon previously, there is already a very evident basis in theory for most major Marxist scholars promoting worker ownership of guns. This is not something that the entire socialist cause would have to adjust for, but rather, go ahead.
Oh, you can finish your sentence real quick. But...
Sure. But rather something already intrinsic to the movement internationally. For this reason, it would not be harmful to any degree for socialists to advocate for gun control as a way of attracting right-wingers, while it would be for other right-wing positions like immigration, opposition to environmental regulation, etc.
Okay. So thank you guys for those opening statements. So now we're going to move into open discussion. I'm going to stop you guys at about 9:15. So you guys can begin however you like.
Sure. So I guess, would you prefer to start at the end of what you said, Pogan, or like more at the beginning? Hello?
Sorry, you mean you want me to finish my statement that I was making in the opening?
Well, no. Would you rather like the points you brought up at the end or the points at the beginning? Like the political arguments or starting with like the public health sort of arguments?
Sure, so I'd prefer to discuss the political arguments.
Sure. I mean, so I think that one of the points that you said very simply is that leftists could use opposition to gun control as a way to bring people over from the right. But I'm not sure that this is a very strong point because most of the gun control proposals that I would be talking about are incredibly popular, like on the order of 70 to 80%. So the right that we're talking about here would be like the 30% that's not in support of those. Those are probably not in general in support of most other socialist policies.
You're saying that you don't right is a significant constituency of the American public on the gun issue such that it would benefit the party to ingratiate them.
Kind of, yeah. But like, it doesn't seem to be a very large thing. And on other, like, in short, I think the constituency who's going to support like open borders immigration and like all the other social left policies that presumably you and I agree on because they're part of that broader socialist vision, and also want guns, is not going to be very big.
I don't think it's like a mutually exclusive thing. I don't think it has to be a situation where, in order to ingratiate them into the movement, we must also make concessions for the other things they have to say, right? It could be a situation where, obviously, blue-collar workers who tend to vote conservative, particularly white blue-collar workers, are already going to be conservative and, for that reason, generally pro-gun, right? So you can appeal
sure,
to
but the conservatism there seems mostly
Go ahead.
I
would just like to, yeah. The appeal there is going to be two-pronged, right? The first thing you say is that we're pro-labor. We intend to, benefit you in that regard. but we're also pro-gun, and we have no interest in depriving you of your right to own firearms. It seems like they're going to be very sympathetic to those things more than they would be sympathetic to other issues such as immigration. It doesn't seem like it has to be an all or nothing thing in terms of ingratiating them.
Sure. So I don't think it's all or nothing. One of the simple questions that I would pose is, why would the goal be to try and convert right-wingers when liberals share more of our values, presumably, and they're more willing to support, like, in short, why would you aim for people who are further from leftism?
Because a significant portion of conservatives in this country are constitutive of the working class. Blue-collar white workers in particular tend to vote conservative almost every election, with some exceptions. And those people who are generally not going to be college educated, they're going to be like laborers of some description, are the exact sort of people that you want to ingratiate into a worker movement. Presumably,
Sure.
presumably you're sympathetic to, forming worker parties and, furthering the cause of the working class. So basically, you're asking something like, why would I want to ingratiate a significant portion of the working class? It seems fairly straightforward.
Well, sure. So the argument is that when we look at like the conservative working class in the United States, as in most other countries, they're like center left on economics, but like pretty hard right on social issues. And so I think that the problem is that this is one of those things where maybe you bite like 1 or 2% of them with this. And so you get like your worker movement slightly larger, but you might be losing liberals as well. I'm not sure that the electoral math, if that's what we're doing here, is actually going to work out. And if the argument's about like raising a revolution, I think that's a separate topic where I don't think the argument that like all these old theoreticians, even if they were right, that it necessarily applies to like the modern state.
Would you prefer to lose liberals, or would you prefer to lose orthodox Marxists generally in support of socialism? Because
Orthodox
we're operating.
I think that there's a lot more liberals than orthodox Marxists. I would, like, as a reformist, I would much rather have 40% of the country than like 0.1. Yeah.
That's not what I'm asking you. What I'm asking you is something like, presumably you understand that the socialist movement, the workers' movement, is being forwarded in this scope by people already sympathetic to Marxism on some level. And the orthodox Marxist position, as I'm sure you're aware, is generally pro-gun, right? A majority of socialists are going to be pro-gun. So it seems like if you appeal to liberal policies, like, say, gun control, removal of worker ownership of firearms in some capacity, you not only risk losing the blue-collar conservative workers that we would want to ingratiate into the movement, you also risk losing socialists already in the movement who consider being pro-gun a staunch position that they're in support of and something that they have to stand by. It seems like you're taking a more significant gamble than the gamble that I'm taking, which is just saying something like, we can ingratiate conservative blue-collar workers on the basis that we're not going to seize their firearms.
Yeah, I think that this is fundamentally just a misunderstanding of what's salient. So salient just means like what people actually care about. People do care about guns, and there are some people for which this is a highly salient issues. But if you study like why people vote one party or the other, the most salient issues are social issues first, and then like broad economic issues second. Guns are going to come like way down the list. In terms of things that actually could like bring or drive people from the movement, it's going to be the big stuff like economic policy and social policy. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that like shifting electoral beliefs on like guns or socialist organizations shifting their beliefs on guns is going to bring people into the movement. If you have evidence on that, I'd love to see it. But just the fact that they're so popular makes it hard for me to believe that's the case.
Are these salient social issues that you're referring to salient in the sense that they're talking about socialist ideals, or are these merely social ideals that would already be issues within a capitalist society? Because if you present, let's take a constituency of blue collar conservative workers, right? And then we ask them something like, in a hypothetical subsequent society, we'd be careful not to say socialism for obvious reasons. You'll still have access to your firearms, and the social issues that you take to be problematic under capitalism are unlikely to exist to nearly the same degree in a subsequent society, right? It's unlikely that you're going to,
yeah, but the social issues they care about.
One second. It's unlikely you're going to have the same level of like issue with these social things that you would in a capitalist society. You're saying then that those social issues that they harp on in the current society necessarily indicate that the gun control issue is not going to be sufficient to bring them over to the left. Am I understanding correctly?
Basically, yeah. So the social issues they're talking about are not like things that they consider to be like things that would be less of an issue under like social society. They're talking about gays and race. Those are the things. It's religion and race. Those are the main reasons across countries in the United States as well why poor people vote conservative. There are literally studies demonstrating that like people support welfare until you like bring it up in a racialized context. It's very easy to see that these are the reasons why people are voting conservative, not because they're worried about, like, I don't know, some sort of social problem that, like, socialism could solve. They want to be socially conservative.
Do you think so? I mean, clearly, as we move closer and closer to a socialist society and away from neoliberal capitalism, I think it's reasonable to suggest something like, even if it is the case those social issues are currently significant to the degree that you're talking about, economic issues, particularly issues concerning labor, will gradually become more and more significant, right? Comparable to something like observed in the Weimar Republic. And then the question, unless you have some argument against
actually, ironically,
sure,
it's probably the reverse.
One second. I'm sure you have some argument against revolution we can get into later, but the point is this. If we move in a direction comparable to the Weimar Republic, I doubt these social issues are going to be as substantive as you claim they are now. And at that point, it's a question of, like, how are you going to appeal to blue-collar, typically conservative workers in such a way that they're more inclined to move towards a socialist movement than they are, say, a fascist one? And one of the issues, again, that would become increasingly relevant in a situation like that economically, is private ownership of firearms. You're talking about the disintegration of the state and the economy. They're obviously going to be pretty opposed to the government instituting martial law or instituting gun control measures that provide them with less access to firearms. So I guess I'm saying something like, I'm not understanding how it's necessarily the case that even if those issues are as significant as you're saying they are now, it'll necessarily be that significant as we move closer and closer to socialism, such that we should try to appeal to liberals more than we do blue-collar conservatives.
Yeah, so I think that the basic take that, like, I don't know what you mean by move closer to. If that's in a reformist context, I think that, or like in a context where people get more and more rights and higher like income, higher and higher share of like the products of their labor, ironically, it might make
closer
social
towards
issues
the
more
predictions
salient.
made by the labor theory of value, specifically, like tendency for rate of profit to fall. Basically, closer to such a situation where, regardless of whether or not you're a reformist or a revolutionary, some significant aspect of society is very likely to shift politically. That's what I'm referring to. Because those are the exact sorts of, just one more thing, those are the exact sorts of situations where fascists like to prey on workers and generate false sympathy for their cause. And I'm saying, why not appeal to them as socialists on the basis of allowing them to own their firearms in order to prevent them from sympathizing with fascists?
So just to finish the point that I was trying to make, in the United States, as we observe like higher and higher wages, we've also observed something called like post-materialism. This is something I recommend the book Politics is for Power a lot, because one of the things they discuss very strongly with like reams upon reams of evidence is that as people get higher and higher incomes, as people get further and further from having to consider politics part of their like existential struggle, they actually care more and more about niche and social issues and less about economic issues. So it depends on the situation that you're describing.
That doesn't have any bearing on what I was talking about here.
Well,
I'm not talking about.
I'm
not talking about a matter of income.
So if what you're describing was like a catastrophist theory of the falling rate of profit, that as the rate of profit falls, capitalist society will start to fall apart, then obviously this doesn't hold true. Is that what you're referring to?
I don't understand why you would bring it up when the point had it in its entirety everything to do with the gradual move towards a society collapsing, a capitalist society specifically, in virtue of the predictions that I was talking about, right? So I'm not talking about how social issues rank in terms of significance as income levels increase or decrease. I'm specifically talking about as we move towards the destruction of capitalism, regardless of whether or not you think that's justified, you can just grant it for a second and entertain the point. Do you think it would be advantageous to sympathize with conservative blue-collar workers who are a significant portion of the working class on some social issue that most socialists would agree on already, rather than trying to take the stance that we should appeal to liberals and implement gun control measures, which would make those very people, those conservative blue-collar workers, probably more sympathetic to something like a far-right conservative or a fascist?
Yeah, I think the answer there is that you want to appeal to people who are most willing to side with. So this is sort of like the Luxemburgist idea that society is going to collapse. You need to be able to organize people in this collapse to like form a socialist revolution, or else you will get barbarism. And so the question is, who are most likely to join that socialist revolution if you believe such a thing is going to happen? And I don't think that the answer is clearly going to be working class conservatives who like guns. It's not clear to me that just because they agree with you on the gun issue, that they're going to agree with you on the rest of these things. They've been propagandized for 50 years now by the conservative media to hate socialism. It's not clear to me that they're going to side with you just because you say that you like guns, because you also say that you like gays and you like women.
But look, the point is, in saying that right? It's not like these are educated people that are aware of the nuances of Marxism and for that reason object to the system. The problem is that they object to the system entirely predicated on the propagandizing of the United States government. If you want to talk about hypotheticals like this, we don't even have to ostensibly refer to ourselves as a socialist or Marxist movement. We can take measures to distance ourselves from those sorts of, those sorts of terms. The point is this: in such a crisis, right, you're basically telling me that it's not advantageous to sympathize with a significant part of the labor class on a social issue they're almost guaranteed to agree with most socialists on, right? Rather, you wish to appeal to liberals on gun control legislation because you think in such a crisis, for some reason, conservatives will just say, well, 50 years ago, the US government told me that communism was bad, and for that reason, I'm not going to side with the working class in a fundamental battle for the future of the United States.
Is your argument that it's more likely that like working class conservatives are going to side with the leftist movement in the collapse of American society?
I'm saying that blue collar workers.
Like, yes or no? Is that the argument?
Yeah, I'm answering your question. I'm saying that blue collar workers who happen to be conservative on social issues in a crisis situation like that are likely to be sympathetic to a labor movement, particularly, and by the way, conservatives form unions all the time. They're already ostensibly pro-labor. But the point is, like, in that situation, right, all that would be required to increase the probability of them being sympathetic to our cause is to appeal to them on a social issue that most socialists already agree with, that being worker ownership of firearms. And you're saying you don't care about that.
Yeah, because
you'd rather appeal to one more second. You'd rather appeal to neoliberals on the basis that we can control guns. And I'm saying you're going to immediately alienate a significant base of supporters that you could have in that exact situation.
This is such an incredibly weak argument. So what we're talking about here is the marginal shift of conservatives from, so context, collapse of society, violent revolution, multiple sides forming. Which way are conservatives going to go? You're talking about the marginal effect, meaning the effect of adopting, like, say, one policy on the effect of, like, how many conservatives are going to join.
We already went over this.
Your argument is that we change one policy and conservatives will shift over to the left. Okay, let's say 1% of conservatives shift over to the left. That doesn't, even if that we grant like this enormous actual, like, that 1% is an enormous amount, even that's probably not enough to make the left win. You brought up the example of the Weimar Republic, right? That actually was one where social issues won out the day. Workers and intellectuals actually in the university sided with the fucking Nazis.
Look, the point, I don't think that's a strong argument. The point is your entire point that you're making here, that you think 1% of the conservative movement are comparable, like an insignificant portion would be sympathetic to our cause on the gun control thing, is predicated on the social issues that they emphasize currently, right? You fundamentally, just a second, please. You're fundamentally misunderstanding a premise here. There's a premise that goes along the lines of, as the world, and by extension the United States, moves closer and closer to some sort of capitalist crisis or capitalist collapse, it's not reasonable prima facie to expect those social issues to hold the same water. Let me give you an example. In a situation where the economy and society is suffering from a crisis and basic amenities start to be lost, or people have difficulties securing basic food, basic water, basic shelter, you better fucking believe that a significant portion of the population of the United States is going to desire private ownership of firearms exactly for the reason that you talked about, a sort of government crackdown in which their guns are seized from them and they have no capacity to defend themselves. And again, considering the vast majority of socialists in the leftosphere, so to speak, are already sympathetic with private gun ownership, it doesn't seem like it would be even remotely difficult at all to bring them over to our side in such a situation on that exact issue, given that it would very likely hold more water. That's what I'm saying.
Sure. Then I think that fundamentally, so I've been working within the framework of capitalist collapse this entire time. I think fundamentally that's the issue that we're going to have to get at, because all of the things that I've been saying have been in the context of the past 200 years of, for most people, rising incomes and rising well-being, rising security. That context is one where social issues are rising up and where these things, where like economic issues are actually decreasingly salient. So why don't we just talk about the collapse theory in particular? What leads you to believe that, like, contra the past 200 years, capitalism is going to in fact get more unstable and more collapse, like directional?
It's two-pronged. There's a general tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and there's a general tendency for capitalists. there's a general tendency for capitalist crises over time to become more and more frequent and more intense. Now, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're going to say in response to this, right? You're going to appeal to the last 200 years of capitalism's existence.
We actually have
make an induction.
I'd
like to finish. I'd like to finish the point that I'm.
Why are you telling me what I'll appeal to instead of just asking me what I'd appeal to?
I'd like to finish the point that I'm making. I'd like to finish the point that I'm making, please.
Okay.
You're going to make it. You're very likely. I won't say you will. You're very likely to make an induction predicated on that. Now, the point is, regardless of what you think the timetable is here or the amount of time necessary for capitalism to begin suffering from these catastrophic crises that I'm talking about, the point is you presumably base level understand that the prediction holds some empirical water. And that's sufficient to say something like, at some point in the future, regardless of the timetable that we're talking about, such a situation that I was talking about socially with bringing workers over to the leftist cause will occur. Now, if you're going to bring up something like, we're unclear on the timetable here, obviously capitalism hasn't collapsed, capitalism has experienced crises already, I agree with that. But the point is, do you have an objection to the prediction that Marx makes in the LTV regarding a tendency for the rate of profit to fall?
So there's basically, so why don't we stay on two things? You brought up two ideas. So first, the idea that crises are increasing over time. This is not clearly borne out in the data. If anything, we've observed fewer and fewer crises over time. Part of that is because states have gotten more and more involved in the economy. There's been an increase of planning, and it's reduced basically the amount of the amount and depth of crises. So like if you look literally at this graph, which goes all the way back to 1871, there's enormously more gray area, meaning recessions, on the left side than there is on the right side, because we have seen an enormous increase actually of of stability as well. You can look at the average point of the green line, which represents growth. Growth has actually increased on average relative to what it was in the past. This is in fact contra the predictions of the falling rate of profit. As well,
is your view that the prediction is false?
So it does seem to be that the rate of profit is falling. It's not clear that the predictions that Marx makes from this falling rate of profit are true.
Do you think the tendency for the rate of profit to fall can be circumvented?
It seems to be, so classically, many Marxists actually have argued that the rate of profit increased after World War II in the United States. They point to this as a form of destruction. The rate of profit increased because there was a big World War and it destroyed all the capital, so there was new capital able to be invested. This does not seem to be the case in my view. I hew closer to like the Solow style growth model, which asserts that fundamental long-term growth rates are limited by technical growth. World War II saw enormous increases of public investment, as did the era afterwards. That drove up the rate of innovation, and that drove up the rate of growth. And that's what we're hoping, in fact, I think, to see right now in the sort of pink wave that we're seeing worldwide.
Temporary suppression of the rate of profit to fall doesn't mean that the tendency has been circumvented. The question was if you think the general tendency over time for profit... Please let me finish my statement. The question was if you think the general tendency for a rates of profit to fall over time can be circumvented simpliciter. You presumably don't believe that.
Sure. So the fundamental formula that Marx points to is indeterminate, because the question is whether the price of capital falls faster than the I'm totally forgetting the terms of this, but basically it breaks down to a question of the rate of innovation versus the rate at which capitalist profits are cut downward. And if the rate of innovation is sufficiently fast enough, it's not clear the rate of profit has to fall. This is something that
are you agnostic on its circumvention then?
I would say that. Are you familiar with the Lucas critique? And no is a fine answer.
I just want to finish the question I'm asking here. Are you agnostic on the circumvention of the rates of profit falling over time?
I'm saying that I am agnostic because of something called the Lucas critique, which is that the mere fact that we observe correlations in the past does not mean that we will observe those correlations in the future, because often those correlations occur in certain economic institutions. If you change the institutions, then the relationships may also change. So one of the things that we observed in the past is there was not a lot of public investment. That's like the period before World War II in particular. We've really seen a regime change since then.
Do you think
tilted it back? But go back.
So your position is not. Let's put it this way. Your position is that it is not very likely or guaranteed, you can choose either of those to object to, that the collapse of capitalism is an inevitability. You're saying, in theory, capitalism could exist in perpetuity. Is that correct?
I don't know that I would make it so absolutely, but sure, I'll say yes.
So, just to clarify, your position is that capitalism can exist in perpetuity?
Under certain conditions, yes.
What are those conditions?
Sure. So it seems like It seems like basically, actually, in fact, the shift towards increased planning of the economy has helped perpetuate capitalism. It seems like the shift towards increased investment in R&D has helped make the economy more stable. And it seems also that if capitalism can attain a green growth, then that might also allow capitalism to survive in perpetuity. So those are sort of the conditions: ecological sustainment and R&D investment.
So even if you believe, okay, that's fine, right? Even if you believe that it is theoretically possible under the right conditions for capitalism to exist in perpetuity, you as a socialist presumably still have the desire for capitalism to be abolished, right?
Yep.
Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah. So this is why the collapse of the failure of collapse theory means that you need an alternative. Capitalism isn't just going to fall apart. You need a way to take it over.
Okay, then if the fundamental disagreement here is just about the mechanism by which capitalism will be abolished, you obviously advocating for reformist policies and me obviously advocating for revolution, it seems like the fundamental disagreement that we need to get to is just why you think revolution is unfeasible, why you think revolution would be unsuccessful in establishing socialism.
Before we quite get onto that, I want to make clear why I was making the point that I was making before. The discussion that we're going to have now about reform versus revolution is all occurring in the context of capitalism not collapsing. The context you were talking about was specifically in capitalism collapsing, people's living standards falling apart, and the need to get as many people as possible for a socialist revolution. I don't think that that is a realistically likely scenario.
I didn't say that's a misrepresentation. I didn't explicitly say that capitalism would need to be collapsing simpliciter. I merely spoke to some sort of capitalistic or economic crisis comparable to the Weimar Republic, right? It's theoretically possible that after the riot, had the Nazis not seized power in Germany, they could have recovered from the Great Depression and the economic catastrophe in the Weimar Republic, but that's not the point, right? Those are the exact sorts of circumstances where you would want to move towards establishing socialism, regardless of which part of the aisle you're on, reform or revolution. So that's why I'm pushing you so hard now to talk about reform versus revolution, because all of that is fairly irrelevant if you don't believe a revolution would be possible. My policies are predicated on advocating for revolution.
Sure. And so this gets at the fundamental question. It's that even were revolution to be a successful tactic, you noted before that there's this litany of Marxist writers, Marx themselves, advocating in favor of revolution. The question is whether that theory is applicable today. And so I think the argument is in fact on you to say that revolution is the most effective way to achieve this form of change, not on me. Because something I would note is there's never been not one successful socialist revolution in a liberal democracy. It's not my duty to prove that your theory is wrong in liberal democracy. It's your duty to prove that it's applicable at all.
Sure. So I have a set of points that I want to make in favor of revolution, right? Capitalists have a motive, in fact, an existential need to control or destroy democracies that threaten their interest, and they have the means to do so, and they have a track record of doing so, right? Capitalists are able to and do consistently capture political power and dictate government policy such that reformism is likely to fail. Reformists who attain administrative power in a bourgeois state and attempt to legislate capitalism out of existence are extremely likely to face bourgeois state, military, or legal repression. I have some support for that. Local capitalists will invest in military reactionaries to preempt anti-capitalist social change, i.e. fascism, a la the Weimar Republic. And outside capitalist countries will invade, bomb, or instigate a coup d'etat to destroy anti-capitalist government, such as the Sandinistas, Mossadegh, etc. Reformists put themselves at a disadvantage, i.e., they're less likely to succeed in such a situation, by dint of their failure to anticipate and prepare for revolution and civil war all along, as well as going through the longer parliamentary process of disempowering capitalists, which gives them more time and opportunity to attack the leftist government, constant financial, political, and social incentives for party leadership to moderate, compromise, and become pro-capitalist, such as funding, perks, bribes, accolades, mainstream media access, relief from social and media pressure, etc., examples being the German SDP in the 1910s and 1920s, as well as IMF labor in 1976. When even a mere progressive liberal such as Sanders or Corbyn, whose proposed policies of less foreign intervention, more welfare, and more regulations do not pose an existential threat to press barons, in particular, and capitalists in general, enters into the public arena, the major media outlets go wild and defame them disproportionately, attempting to delegitimize their policies and deprive them of popularity and votes. Some support for that below. The unelected officials who constitute the overwhelming majority of the government and the state are overwhelmingly pro-capitalist, 1. 2. Votes in elections are primarily acquired via advertising. Advertising requires funding, and capitalists having millions or even billions of dollars at their disposal can consistently outfund unions, etc. Consequently, capitalists can effectively buy politicians through campaign funding, lobbying, and favorable press coverage, and exert a disproportionate influence over policymaking, thereby overriding the ability of the public to influence politics. And three, the dominant status quo political parties often systematically filter genuine populists and radicals out of leadership roles and prominent positions. Consequently, the voting public is usually only able to ratify a limited spectrum of pre-selected status quo candidates, examples being the DSA superdelegates, the Labor 35 minister nominations. It is true that some of the military and economic pressures outlined will be faced by a revolutionary movement, but the point is that these things decrease the probability of success. If you add to what is already an uncertain outcome an extra set of challenges, reformism becomes inadmissible.
Sure. So you've listed out this very long list of challenges. Congrats on like the nice script there. The question that I posed is, why should we believe that revolution is feasible in the first world, like in liberal democracies? All you've said there are challenges to reform. You haven't actually proven that revolution is feasible. I want to remind you that there's in fact a third option here, the black pill. It may be that revolution and reform are infeasible and capitalism will never go away.
Look, the argument there is going to be that even if it's difficult or exceedingly challenging to establish socialism, regardless of what part of the political aisle you lean on, that we ought not do it. You and I are both socialists, right? You and I have a fundamental desire, regardless of how we approach it, to establish a socialist society. The only thing we disagree on is the means. So even if you were to say, let's just take the black pill and say something like, it's exceedingly improbable, nigh impossible for socialism to be achieved in our time, given that mutual desire, for the reasons that I just provided you, one still ought to advocate for socialism in a revolutionary context, right? Simply taking the black pill and saying something like simply taking the black pill and saying something like, oh, well, it's really fucking difficult is not a reason for either of us to stop.
But it's not that it's really fucking difficult. It's that it may be impossible. I think that basically the problem that I'm trying to pose to you is that to prove that revolution is feasible in the modern world is not the same thing as to prove that reform is unlikely. All of what you posed here, the fact that there's an enormous administrative power opposed to socialism, that there is legal and military repression via fascism, that there's foreign intervention, that compromise is often forced on like socialist movements, that capitalists have more money than we do, and that often they infiltrate our leadership and force more.
But look, the point, SDL,
all of these things apply to revolutionary movements. Maybe we're just maybe socialism's never going to win.
SDL, the point is that cuts across the aisle and applies to you just as effectively. Socialism hasn't been achieved through reform in a liberal democracy either, in a liberal capitalist society, right? So sure. just as effectively as you say, well, revolution hasn't achieved socialism in those countries, I could say the same thing about reform, and then you and I are just in the same position where now we need to present some sort of reason why the other person's position is inadmissible. I've given you my reasons. I'm asking you specifically, since you made the claim that revolution may be impossible in a first world liberal society, to substantiate that claim.
Sure. And so the thing that I point to here is the very long history of increasing, basically, you would call them concessions, and I would call them reforms in these liberal democracies. For roughly a century now, since 1925 or so, there's been an increase in state spending from give or take 3% to give or take 45% in Western high-income countries. That is an enormous amount of spending. Of that, it went from around less than 1% to around 20 to 30%.
This isn't responding. Look, this isn't the claim that you're trying to substantiate is why revolution may be impossible. You're just providing arguments for reform. I'm asking, since you said revolution may be feasible. Look, the question was why you think revolution may be impossible. I'm asking you to substantiate that claim in particular.
Sure. So generally, when we've looked at like more revolutionary attempts in the West, they've been violently suppressed. Even movements that weren't like actively attempting revolution, like the Black Panthers, were bombed by the U.S. state. If you're willing to believe that the U.S. state is willing to go abroad and coup countries and massacre civilians to prevent socialism there, why do we have any reason to believe that they would be any less heinous in their own country? Same for virtually any other capitalist power. Right. In fact, I would just note, like, there hasn't been even a socialist revolution successful, with the possible exception of Nepal, since like 1990, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It seems like the U.S. hegemony is really powerful.
Look, that's fine. Let's try this another way, right? You presumably accept that leftist revolutionary movements have been successful in non-quote-unquote neoliberal societies, the USSR, Maoist China, Cuba, Cambodia, etc. So then the line of demarcation there is what you think is special about a neoliberal society such that reform, quote unquote, or sorry, revolution,
all of
quote
those
unquote, may
countries were
be
incredibly,
impossible.
incredibly poor. That's the line. Those countries were near agrarian almost entirely. The society we live in today has something like 60 times the average income of what they had. I don't even know, why would you even compare the two?
Look, the point is, what does any of that look? Why does any of that speak to an increased probability that revolution may be impossible in a first world neoliberal society? That's the question you're being asked.
More to lose than just their chains. When you're asking people to pick up arms and throw their life away for the chance of seizing the means of production, but they've already got a pretty good life, they're much, much less likely to do it. That's why we've seen the rate of successful revolutions decline and decline and decline over time, because people are less willing to put their lives on the line.
That doesn't actually answer the question either, because the question is, you again, I don't know why I have to reiterate this. You and I have a mutual desire to establish socialism, right? So then the question is just, given your position that you think revolution may be impossible, right? You want to say something like workers, you want to say something like workers in first world neoliberal nations are considerably wealthier than people were in states like, the USSR or Russia pre-Soviet Union, China pre-CCP, etc. That doesn't mean that as capitalist crises increase in intensity.
This is related to the crisis theory, right? Look, so you're relying on the crisis theory to make
I don't understand.
Make the revolution
I'd like to finish. I'd like to finish the point. Even if you're contentious on that, right? All that would be necessary, unless you have some objection to achieve socialism in a crisis comparable to the Weimar Republic or something along those lines, is galvanizing the working class such that they support the cause of socialism and seize the means of production. And you're saying even in such a case, because of your claim, that may be impossible. So let's present a thought experiment here, right? The United States has deteriorated to a state comparable to the Weimar Republic pre-Nazis, right? Mm-hmm. Point number 2, we now have the opportunity to move towards socialism given sufficient support, and that's going to most expediently be achieved through a revolution. Why in that case as well do you think revolution may be impossible?
In the case where revolution is feasible, I would be willing, like if it were the case that the United States were like collapsing and revolution were feasible and likely, then obviously I wouldn't say revolution is impossible. What? The whole point is that we don't live there.
But then the contention is you saying something like the US will never regress to a point comparable to the Weimar Republic when it already has, right? I'm sure you'd agree the Great Depression, even though, maybe Nazis didn't seize power during the Great Depression.
How far do you think people's incomes fell during the Great Recession?
The Great Depression is what I said.
During the Great Depression, right? World GDP was cut by like a third or something. The Great Recession cut it by like 5% over 2 years. We're already talking about 5% of like a 6 times higher income than back then. Like these are just not comparable.
This is absurd, though, right? Relative to the income they had prior and since, the point is, during the Great Depression, the working class in particular not only suffered a significant decrease in conditions.
It was real bad, but it wasn't as bad as the Great fucking Depression. You kidding?
What are you? I'm talking about the Great Depression.
Yeah, but
the 1920s.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the point is, during the Great Depression, workers suffered from a significant decrease in quality of life, a significant decrease in overall income. There were fucking bread lines. People were starving to death. People raided banks and were unable to secure their funds. Right. Yada yada yada. The point is that is a marked decrease in their standards of living relative to prior and since. So you're saying, even in that case, that you don't think revolution would be feasible, and I'm asking in a neoliberal society specifically, and I'm asking for the argument for that.
Well, so if you're talking about the Great Depression in the United States, like it was not neoliberal, it was just like pre-welfare state, basically. What I would point to there is that fascists were almost almost to a T, more successful in that environment than were socialists. Almost the entirety of Europe shifted right in the Great Depression. This is a really bad example. They won in Spain, they won in Italy, they won in Austria, they won in Germany. How many more do I need to list? The only country where they won in the Great Depression era was
even though I think that's contentious, the point still, and I don't understand why I have to reiterate, the point even in that case is you're saying revolution may be impossible. You're not merely speaking to the effectiveness of reform or trying to suggest something along the lines of like, oh, well, it's the case that
trying to get like some sort of romantic thing. I'm not trying to say that it's impossible. I'm saying it's much, much, much less likely to succeed.
Okay, but that's a comparable claim. I'm asking for the justification for that in neoliberal societies as well.
Sure, because we've also very rarely even seen any revolution or any mass violent action in the first world. This is why we've seen the decline of mass violent action in the world overall, because people's incomes have risen. If you need something on the order of the Great Depression to get people back to that, it seems like we're getting further and further from that world.
How does it follow from a lack of revolutionary leftist action in neoliberal societies that it may be more unlikely than reform? Right? The whole point here is that we're talking about it. Hold on. The whole point is we're talking about a hypothetical situation in which conditions for workers are comparable to those that they experienced in the Great Depression. And again, and I don't know why you're trying to evade this. The point even then is that you're saying reform may be unlikely. And I don't understand the reasoning for that.
So I'm not trying to say that were conditions to get back to like the Great Depression, that revolution wouldn't be more likely. I'm saying that revolution may have been more successful as a strategy in the even in the 40s or something, even possibly in the First World, but possibly not, because when socialist revolutions were attempted, they failed. They were crushed in what was it, like Hungary and in Spain.
Okay. Then you've basically agreed to the central point of the debate, which is, one, workers ought own firearms as a means of furthering revolutionary agendas. Two, you presumably agree it's not impossible for the United States and other neoliberal societies to regress to a point comparable to the Great Depression. Three, in such a situation, right, there are very good reasons why we would expect revolution to be successful given sufficient class consciousness and education of the working class, right? Therefore, that is a compelling reason for workers to own firearms and not have firearms taken from them, because that is a very real possibility. And in such a situation, revolution, as you've conceded, is a viable agenda to establishing socialism, which is a desire both you and I have. That's a reason to be resistant of gun control towards the working class.
If the best argument you have for widespread household gun ownership is that the United States might have an economic crisis so bad that it becomes like 1930s Weimar Republic Germany, and that we might be able to win a revolution in that case, I think that you need to compare it to the known costs of gun control right now in terms of public health, which mostly fuck over the workers and fuck over workers like self-advancement, because they mostly fuck over worker like housing and worker ability to improve their own districts and lives. And then also, you need to compare it to the fact that possibly siding with liberals might get us those reforms and might actually be able to change people's minds. One of the big things that I've been trying to point you to is that the reason the poor vote conservative is because they're socially conservative. Siding with the libs to make the poor's less conservative is a good leftist strategy. Even if you believe this revolution is coming, it's also a good leftist strategy, because you don't want those conservatives siding with the fascists because they hate the gays. You want them not caring about social issues and only caring about economic issues. Like, I think I could easily make the argument.
I just want to return to the point that I was making, because you again tried to like slide past it, right? The point is, one, you presumably understand that it is not unrealistic to expect something comparable to that situation in the future. I think it's unrealistic.
You said possible, and I agreed to that, but unrealistic, no.
You think it's okay? This is an entirely different claim. Then you think it's unrealistic for neoliberal capitalism to regress to the point, or something comparable to the Great Depression, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I don't think that's very likely. Like, barring global ecological collapse, probably not, no.
Well, I mean, that in and of itself is something that's very likely to occur, so I'm not sure what the point of bringing that up was, but I just want to return to something very briefly, and then I'll let you respond, right? Again, this all hinges on a mutual desire you and I have, which is the establishment of socialism, and I presented you with good reason in a at least plausible economic scenario why workers should own firearms, and by extension why it would be conceivable that revolution would be conducive to establishing socialism. So then the question is this: if you accept that that's a possibility and that's a legitimate reason for worker ownership of firearms, you presumably have some desire higher on the hierarchy than establishing socialism, be that public health, be that immediate improvements in quality of life. So can you tell me straightforwardly what desire you place at a greater emphasis than the establishment of socialism, such that you want to restrict ownership of firearms among workers? So presumably it's public health, because that's what you've been talking about this whole time, right?
So the argument that I raised was literally just now that even under the condition of a collapse it may be the case that prefiguratively, before this collapse occurs, it may be better. So let's imagine that we think that capitalism is going to collapse due to ecological crisis. We've got, I don't know, 30 years till it's going to happen. What are we going to do in those 30 years? Option one is we are now pro-gun. We're trying to win over the conservatives to be pro-gun to get ready for this coming ecological collapse. Option two is we side with the liberals electorally. We're willing to take the anti-gun position. And as a result, social policy moves significantly to the left. People move significantly to the left on those social issues, like we've seen on gay marriage, like we've seen actually on race issues.
But that's a separate argument. Look, but the point is that, look, the argument that we ought prevent worker deaths and negative outcomes for workers as a consequence of gun ownership is a different argument from saying it's conducive to establishing socialism. Right. The whole point here is that what I'm advocating for is a situation.
That's the point, actually. So the point I was trying to say is, if you don't want the conservative,
I don't know why it's necessary to interrupt me right before I make a point. Right. I'm trying to finish a point. The point is,
to make this point.
I'm giving you a situation where it would be conducive for workers to own firearms, and you're saying, well, in the time between now and such a crisis that would precipitate a situation like that, I would still advocate for things that reduce social harms. And that seems to suggest you either, one, have some sort of very clear idea of how crises develop and when they're going to happen, which even like academic economists aren't really clear on exactly when a crisis will happen. They sort of just emerge as a consequence of the capitalist mode of production and market forces. Or it's suggesting that you have a greater desire than the outcome of establishing socialism, which seems to be public health. And you and I are just going to fundamentally disagree on what our hierarchy of desires is there.
But so I think that you're trying to paint me into an argument that I actually haven't made yet. So can I walk you through the steps of these? Let's say there's an ecological crisis coming in the next 10 to 40 years. Since you seem to be willing to agree to that, right?
One more time.
There is like an ecological crisis you think is coming, I don't know, 10, 40 years in the future.
Roughly.
Sure. So you agree then that we as socialists have like a decision on what to do with our 10 to 40 years left of society not collapsing.
I think there are steps that can be taken to sort of like postpone that sort of outcome, but I think such steps would only be realistic under socialism. I certainly don't think taking those steps is realistic under capitalism.
Sure, but we're not going to get a socialist revolution until the collapse happens, right? Because apparently we need to have it.
That's not my position. My position isn't merely that a revolution would only be possible in a collapse. I just said a collapse would be conducive to organizing a revolution. Okay. That's not to say a revolution would be impossible prior. I think you can disseminate socialist information and achieve class consciousness prior to that, such that a revolution would be feasible.
Okay, sure. So let's focus then mostly on the collapse. So we can talk about whether the revolution is feasible without the collapse, but let's just focus on the collapse. My argument is that siding with libs for 10 to 40 years to try and move people to the left on social issues will make that collapse less likely for workers to side with conservatives because they will be less socially right-wing. Do you think that that is a reasonable position?
I don't think it has much bearing on what we're talking about. The entire point is that if we're talking about ecological collapse within the timetable of 10 to 40 years, right, the point is like, you presumably are granting for the sake of argument that that would happen. And then the question is, what's going to be most expedient to preventing either the collapse entirely or disastrous consequences as a result of the collapse if it does happen? Like, that is to say, how do we minimize the effects? And you want to say that the way to achieve that is to appeal to neoliberals, or I'm sorry, liberals specifically in the US, who, by the way, have their own storied history of suppressing socialist movements of all kinds,
much
even
like
non-revolutionary. Hold on, SDL, hold on. Liberals have their own storied history of suppressing socialist movements, even non-revolutionary ones, but you want to appeal to them and have them sympathetic on the gun control issue. And you think that's going to be more expedient and more effective than the alternative, which is a worker socialist revolt that establishes socialism, and then it almost immediately takes the steps necessary to prevent the impact of that collapse to some degree. Right? That's your position.
If your position is that capitalism can't solve these issues, then you are literally requiring a global socialist revolution to solve these. And I do not think that's very likely in the next 10 to 40 years. No.
That doesn't follow either. You're a reformist. You still want socialism. You just think it can be achieved through reforming capitalism. And I'm saying, I'm saying, if there's mutual acceptance that socialism would be effective in negating the consequences of that collapse to some degree, and you agree that similar things can't be done under capitalism, then the only question remaining is what's most expedient towards that goal, reform or revolution. And I've given you a set of reasons to think revolution would be more effective.
Sure. So this is actually precisely this is maybe another issue that probably differentiates more revolutionary and modern reformist liberals. So I tend to side with more of the green growth sort of side of things. So I do think that you can make reforms towards green growth. There's a very nice piece that I would point to by Lee Phillips, which is about it's sort of anti-degrowth, and suggests that as we move towards increasing amounts of like state planning, especially in the energy and like transportation sectors, that we can rapidly decarbonify the economy. We've done it in the past. France did it with their nuclearization. Increased state planning can do so in the future. So how do we get to that? How do we just either stave off or prevent the crisis? The answer is you've got to seize the means of like the levers of power to try and shift back in that direction. And so I'm not sure that a revolution is more likely in the next like 10 years.
Do you think that capitalists have a more vested interest in securing profits or a more vested interest in quote unquote saving the environment? Presumably the former, right? You presumably think their priority, as it has always been and always will be extraction of profit, right? So
sure,
the point
we've
there,
actually seen an enormous shift towards green growth. So I don't think this argument necessarily follows. Like, if anything, we've already started to see the beginnings of decoupling.
If the point is, if you agree that socialism would be necessary in some capacity to stop the collapse, then the question is, what is a capitalist who owns means of production going to prioritize? Is he going to prioritize the establishment of a system that makes his existence entirely irrelevant and by extension places him in the working class, a position he fundamentally doesn't want to be in? Or do you think he's going to resist such a movement, even if it's a reformist one? The answer, of course, being the latter.
The answer,
right? We already have substantial evidence. Hold on. When I finish speaking, I'm more than happy to let you respond. The point is, there's plenty of evidence of liberals, just like conservatives, as you want to say, suppressing socialist and Marxist movements, even non-violent ones. So I'm not seeing the reason to think capitalists one day will suddenly, quote unquote, wake up and take steps to protect the environment and sympathize with socialists rather than doing what they've continuously done for the last 100 years or so, which is maximize profit even at the expense of everything else.
So one of the things I think that you're like very much underestimating is how much capitalists want to survive and how much they'll take like a 1% hit to their profits if they can keep making exorbitant profits years and years.
It's not going to be a 1%. It's not even. It's a substantial hit to their profits.
For the past century, right? For the past century, we through reforms, through if you want to call them concessions, managed to go from like 5% government spending to like 45%, and of that, an enormous portion goes to workers. I mentioned that social spending went from like 1% to around, I think the average is 30%. We're taking an enormous chunk of capitalist profits. If the argument were that they are so unwilling to even give 1 or 2 or 3% of their profits, that they would literally like take up arms and support fascism to oppose us, we would not have observed this. We currently live in the world created by these reforms. So this just is anti-historical. The idea that capitalists are going to like fucking destroy the entire earth because they're unwilling to give up like 1, 2, 3% of profits, particularly when it is so popular in this country, when there's such a big democratic movement against it, I don't think it lines up with history. We're already in fact starting to see the beginning of decoupling.
The entire point of what we were talking about is what's going to be most effective and expedient to preventing the collapse, right? And unless you think that suddenly capitalists are going to take all the steps necessary to prevent that collapse or minimize that collapse, which they fundamentally can't do because inevitably that would substantially cut into their profits, you understand, just like they have in the past by suppressing Marxist and socialist movements, even nonviolent ones, that they would suppress a movement like that due to the threat it poses to their profits, right? So then, given the mutual desire to prevent or alleviate the consequences of collapse, the only question remaining is what's going to be most expedient and efficient towards moving towards the ideal outcome for the greatest number of people. You want to say negotiations and reforms with liberals and capitalists, which we have plenty of evidence of proving not unsuccessful in the sense that it actually establishes socialism. They merely give concessions, like you mentioned earlier. The other option is a worker revolution, which immediately establishes socialism.
Why do we think they won't give concessions again?
And seizes the means of production, right? Which, as long as you don't think like we're going to descend into authoritarianism immediately, would lead to an immediate reduction of the possible harms caused by an ecological collapse. That's the central point. It's all about what's most expedient and efficient here. And I'm saying, because you haven't presented a reason for me to not believe that revolution would be most expedient and successful, that we ought advocate for revolution. And going back to the central point of the whole debate, obviously a revolution of the kind that Marxists talk about would necessitate worker ownership of firearms.
Sure. So I think the point that you're really not engaging with is that we have seen these concessions. The very thing that you say capitalists will never ever do is the very history of the past century. I really strongly recommend the book. I kind of two books here. One is much lighter reading. It's The Narrow Corridor by Darren Edgermoglu. Edgermoglu is like a left liberal. They're by no means a socialist, but they very clearly lay out that the modern democratic state was a big bargain by the elites to slowly give away their profits over time to avoid a revolution. We live in that world. The revolution is no longer feasible. They've already given away enough of their profits that now the workers have more than our chains. We can't go back there unless we're accelerationists. So we got to work within the system. We got to reform. In short, the answer is they've given these concessions before. There's little to no reason to believe they won't give these concessions again, particularly when environmental policy is, as I'm trying to say, so incredibly popular and, if anything, tied to future capitalist profits. Jeff Bezos wants to make money 20 years from now. He doesn't get that if the United States collapses.
It's not,
he wants
look,
the United States to survive.
It's not a look. It's not merely about making concessions. It's about the ultimate goal that you and I've said this like 3 times. The ultimate goal you and I share of establishing socialism, right? It's not sufficient to just say something like they may give concessions such that a crisis would be averted, because that in and of itself doesn't lend any credence. Look, that in and of itself doesn't lend any credence to the idea that somehow increases the probability of socialism being established, when capitalists fundamentally are not only still in power, but in virtue of those concessions, workers are less active in pursuing socialist reforms that you're talking about because they've been placated, right? Those concessions are the very things that are going to reduce the activism and the intensity of a leftist movement. So if you want to establish socialism, right, for the reasons that I've provided multiple times now, it doesn't seem clear to me that one ought be advocating reform over revolution, even when presented with a collapse like this, even presented with possible concessions that capitalists could make. Those concessions, just as easily as you think they could avert a collapse, will just as easily placate workers and make them less interested in establishing socialism, thus preventing the worker exploitation that would still exist as these reforms are being pushed fundamentally.
So to try and link it all up, the reason why I'm talking about them giving the concessions is that it will remove the collapse that you think is coming, or at least it will severely obviate it. And they don't need to remove it. They just need to reduce it enough to the point that the revolution isn't coming. Because a big part of this argument has been, you say it is plausible, it is realistic that a collapse on the order of 1930s Great Depression Weimar Republic is coming to the first world. That is what makes it plausible to think that a revolution using guns of the old 1910s Soviet style is realistic. The problem that I'm trying to pose to you is I think that capitalists are infinitely more willing to give up 5% of their profits to preserve the other 45% than they are to give, they're willing to give 0% and just really, really hope that the economy doesn't collapse, as you're talking about. If anything, Pogan, it feels like your position should be the accelerationist one. You should be anti-green policy. You should be like voting Republican to try and cause the collapse.
The point is that merely preventing the collapse and making the sorts of concessions that you're talking about doesn't necessitate that that's somehow conducive to establishing socialism. I can conceive of a situation very plausibly where those sorts of concessions actually decrease the effectiveness of a leftist socialist movement rather. And in such a situation, even if the crisis was averted through those concessions, 2 things remain. The first is that capitalists still own the means of production, right? The second is that worker exploitation under capitalism is still occurring, right? People are not being given the full value of their labor, something you presumably desire to happen. So you can talk about accelerationism if you like. The point is, regardless of whether or not you think a crisis could be averted through reforms, we have a more expedient way of not only changing the outcome of such a crisis or alleviating such a crisis, but also establishing socialism and preventing the exploitation that you take issue with, and that's revolution. I've presented you with a set of reasons to think revolution is feasible, and you've sort of like danced past them, instead talking about the reforms that are possible within capitalism, which don't necessitate any greater chance of socialism being established.
So if you want to go like through the full model of reform, we unfortunately don't have time because Shiny is going to make us do the AMA thing. The very short answer that I would point to is the one I want to say, what's his face? I'm reading a book by a guy named David Schweikart, who wrote After Capitalism. And one of the things that he outlines is exactly what I'm trying to outline here, that revolution of the old style is not feasible. The reforms that we should be trying to point to are piecemeal, taking away capitalist power, giving it to the workers, and then using that additional power to take more power from the capitalists, which in long is, I think, the story of the past century. The more profits that we take away, the more equally wealth is distributed, the less power capitalists have. So in short, the answer of how does reform shift how does reform get us closer to socialism? Is it distributes power from capitalists to workers. Capitalists don't have this binary power or nothing. Power comes from institutions that we can control.
That argument presupposes that along that process of linearly decreasing the amount of power that capitalists have, that they won't take the exact measures that they've taken in the past to suppress Marxist and socialist movements, right? Liberals and conservatives, whoever happens to be in power of over the United States at the time, both political parties have absolutely suppressed even peaceful Marxist and socialist movements, right? So those linear decreases in the amount of power that capitalists have are not going to happen just absent any sort of response from capitalists. Capitalists are going to take steps to prevent those reforms from occurring in the degree that you're talking about, because it threatens their whole existential desire, the entire reason they exist, which is the pursuit and accumulation of capital. That's fundamental to the existence of the capitalist class. What's the reason to think they'll just sit idly by as reformists move? Just a second. What's the reason to think they'll just sit idly by as reformists push closer and closer and closer to socialism, and the response to that is just going to be, well, I guess it's out of our hands. They voted for a socialist. It's over, guys. Pack it up. That's obviously not going to happen. They're going to take steps to suppress those sorts of movements.
Sure, and I feel like this is just this is so obviously absurd that it feels like that's not an honest engagement with like reformist theory. The answer is you take away their power. So they're not trying to sit idly by. You've taken away their ability to do anything more than sit idly by.
How are you going to take away their power such that they can't respond to Marxist and socialist movements in the exact way that they have?
Sure. What are the ways that capitalists have power? Like private ownership of the media, private ownership of, in general, like a huge assortment of institutions that hold power. We can go down the list. We don't have the time for it. But the goal is that you try and make those institutions more and more and more amenable to democracy as a whole, and in particular, democracy of the poor. The very short answer is that where wealth is power, you need to make it so that it no longer is.
But look, presumably you understand that the people in positions of power on some level, regardless of sometimes making concessions, are capitalist sympathizers, right? They absolutely kowtow to capitalists in almost every echelon of the government, right? So when you say something like, oh, well, the way we achieve reform and the way we move closer and closer towards worker ownership of means of production in reformist theory is just something like we take away their positions of power, that's exactly the thing you need to substantiate. You need to substantiate how reformist socialists will take away those positions of power such that it wouldn't immediately entice a response from capitalists, which are the same exact responses that we've observed throughout history, like I pointed out several times.
I think we're just at about time. The answer that I'd give is in short, pretty similar to the answer that I gave over time, is that capitalists are willing to give up 1% of their profits so that we don't take it all instantly. They are happy to do a concession to avoid a revolution, and I don't think that revolution is really coming. They're willing to give up because we have democratic power.
Let me clarify exactly what I'm asking. I think I'm asking something simple.
Real quick, we are almost done here, so if you guys can just
I'll be very
thought, and then we can go into closings. All right.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. It seems like what you're suggesting is that capitalists are just stupid, right? Like they're not aware of the sorts of conditions and the sorts of movements that would lead them to losing a substantial amount of their power such that they lose the ability to respond at all, right? They're clearly aware of such things, which is the exact reason they've responded in the way they have to socialist and Marxist movements throughout history. Now, you need to substantiate how reformist socialists are going to prevent them from doing even that, and I see no argument for that presented so far. You seem to say things like, well, we take away 1% of their power, then another 1%, so on and so forth, but that presupposes the idea that they're not going to respond upon realizing that they're losing too substantial a degree of their power.
All right, STL, you can respond real quick, and then we can, if you want, or we can just go into closings, whatever you want.
I might just do it as the closing then.
All right, yeah, you're going to go first for closings anyway, so we can move on to closing statements now. Just so everyone in the audience knows, in case you didn't see my message in text chat, we're going to go into a Q&A afterwards. So you can start typing your questions out now. If you have any questions for either of them, make sure you specify if it's for one of them or the other, and ping me so I can see it. That being said, we're going to go to closing statements now. So SDL, you have 5 minutes for your closing statement, and you can start whenever you're ready.
Sure. So just to do the bit that I did at the beginning, which we didn't focus too much on, I think the basic argument against guns from a public health perspective is really large public health negatives involving murder and suicide, enormous evidence for suicide, weaker but still strong evidence for homicide, and little evidence of public health positives. There's weak evidence at best, and I think, if anything, negative evidence for guns as self-defense. So from a public health perspective, guns are pretty unambiguously bad. And so the types of gun control proposals that I support, like licensing, waiting periods, I'm blanking on a few of the others, but I can go pull up a list if any of you want to ask, are generally very, very popular. And I don't think that there's much evidence that moving towards the second bit, which is what most of this discussion focused on, that adopting these gun control proposals would meaningfully hurt the leftist movement. Even if, so to be clear, this was somewhat brushed over in this conversation, but many of the gun control proposals that I support would not meaningfully even make it so that armed revolution were less possible. One of the big things that I'm actually in favor of is like community armories. If we're going to have gun ownership, I'm happy to give it to the community as a whole rather than having it be in civilian ownership. So like that's sort of like the position that I would move towards once we want to have the revolution. We didn't get into that too much. I was more or less defending the position in this debate like of gun bans, and I'm happy to do that. Certainly just to take the position so we don't have to get into all this like dumb nuanced stuff. And it makes it easier to again have sort of the discussion on the classic leftist gun argument, which is really not about guns from a public health perspective. It's about guns as a political tool. The Mao quote that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So the question is that true? And I think there's some truth to it, especially in weaker states and with poorer populations. The problem is that we don't live in those weaker states and we don't live with those poorer populations. The models of revolution that Marx pointed to, that Lenin pointed to, that Mao pointed to were amenable and were good, I think, for the countries that they lived in and the times they lived in. But they are no longer because, as I've said repeatedly, workers have much more to lose than just their chains nowadays. Like the average income per person in the Russian Revolution was around $1,000 per person. The average income in the United States is $63,000. It's an order of magnitude that is like hard to comprehend. And that's not like even indicating all the technical changes and growth of the state. The state is immensely more powerful. So I don't think the revolutionary model works. I think that we've observed over this time period a very long shift towards increased concessions from the capitalists that I do think transfer power from capitalists to the workers. The answer of how we keep going down this path is in part the same answer that we've always given. The capitalists are more willing to give a part of their wealth than all of it, so we can get that without them violently resisting. The other answer is that we try and take the wealth from them that gives us the ability to get more power in the future. You want stuff like publicly funded media. You want stuff like reduced wealth inequality, because those things meaningfully take away from the power of the capitalists. Said policies have been implemented in the past, and said policies can be implemented again in the future. I think that I hope it's not clear yet, but I think we're starting to see the rise of a current global pink wave as an end to the neoliberal era. So I very much hope that these predictions hold true, and we do start to see a return to the historical trend of increasing social spending and state planning in the first world liberal democracies.
Okay. Is that it for your closing remarks?
Guns bad. Pogan, you're okay.
Okay. Thank you, STL. Now, Pogan, if you'd like to respond, you can have the last word. You have 5 minutes whenever you want to begin.
Sure. So, like I predicted at the beginning of this, it's more a discussion of what's most expedient to establishing socialism and whether that's going to involve gun ownership. I think I presented a fairly compelling case for why taking firearms away from workers is less expedient and less effective in terms of establishing socialism, particularly in the sorts of economic and ecological crises that we're likely to face in the next 10 to 40 years. Further, I provided a pretty substantial point regarding why conservatives would be more likely to ingratiate themselves into a socialist movement if socialists appeal to them on the basis of gun ownership. I think I recall SDL saying something about support for gun control being popular. I don't believe that's the case. There's a couple pieces of evidence that I would appeal to suggesting that support for strict U.S. gun laws is at the lowest level it's been since 2016. So the idea that it's somehow going to be an easy way of appealing to people if we support gun control legislation doesn't seem to be substantive. Further, I appeal to the fact that conservatives and liberals alike have suppressed Marxist and socialist movements throughout history. Even liberals, who SDL wants to appeal to as being more sympathetic to a socialist cause and more easy to ingratiate into a cause, have consistently oppressed and squashed and infiltrated socialist and Marxist movements throughout this country's history, even peaceful ones, right? And finally, I think the case for revolution can be very effectively made just on the basis that capitalists, by their very nature, have a vested interest in accumulating and retaining control of capital. SDL wants to propose reformist policies to gradually remove capitalist power, but that suggests that capitalists are somehow stupid and short-sighted enough to not realize that power is being taken away from them, such that they're going to substantially lose their profits and lose control of society. The historical record absolutely reflects that capitalists will suppress such movements whenever they gain meaningful ground or pose a significant risk to the accumulation of capital. The fact that they sometimes make concessions to that end does not in any way suggest that they would be allowing a socialist movement to take control away from them through reformist policies. With that, I'd
Hello?
Did he cut out? Wasn't
I
sure
think
if he was-
Can you
Pogan
hear
cut
me?
out for me.
Oh,
Pogan,
okay,
could you
there
just
you go.
repeat your last sentence?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
my
think
last
you-
my yeah, I think my last sentence was just thanking SDL and Shiny in the room, unless I was in the middle of like some other point.
Yeah, anytime, Lib.
Okay. Okay, good. I guess we got everything then. All right. So thank you guys for those closing statements and for participating in this debate. We'll now move on to the Q&A. So I'm going to start with a question from Monody, who actually couldn't be here tonight because he had to go to
Oh,
sleep.
no.
But I think this is for you, SDL, because it's specifically asking about like gun policy, and Pogan presumably isn't in favor of any kind of gun policy. So he asks, a lot of the empirical effects of various types of gun laws have been found to be the result of model specifications, and those effects don't survive, and the effects found greatly vary. Oh, the effects found greatly vary once model uncertainty is introduced. How should gun policy be made given the credibility issues with the current gun control literature? For reference, and then he quotes a study saying the results
Is
of
it the
DOD
RAND
and
study?
which study?
RAND, RAND Corporation. It doesn't matter. It's fine. It's fine.
I'm not sure, but do you understand the gist
Yeah,
of the
so
question?
I think the basic argument that they're raising,
As well in
the basic
debate
argument
discussion.
the basic argument that they're raising is that gun control studies often use a lot of different methodologies. Their argument is that when you use different methodologies, sometimes the conclusions survive as significant, sometimes they don't. I think that generally, what I would point to is that the higher quality studies, the ones that use like differences in differences and that look at specifically highly causal events, those seem to also find pretty strong evidence of guns on homicide. I don't think this is much of a problem for the evidence on gun suicide, because there the evidence is almost unanimous. There have been meta studies done on guns and suicide, and it's virtually unanimous that guns increase suicide. The question is merely by how much. So I think the low ball estimate is like 1.25 times. The high ball is like times 10. For homicide, it's more mixed. And I think a lot of that comes to, it's hard to measure homicide. Homicide varies a lot year by year. There are a lot of different methodologies. And it's hard to measure gun prevalence as well. So I think there are known flaws in these studies. What I would point to here is stuff like meta studies again. Recently, not recently, 4 years ago, the RAND Corporation did a study. That's why I was referencing it, Shiny, which did a partial meta study on a lot of policies relating to reducing gun death. And they found that across multiple models, there was strong evidence for, I want to say, 5 gun policies as reducing homicide. Their estimate was that adopting all of them would reduce total gun homicide in the United States by 11%.
Okay. Well, hopefully that answered Monty's question. I guess we'll find out when he's agree.
Yeah.
All right. So Canadian Catholic wanted to ask a question in VC. Hopefully it's a serious question. Canadian Catholic, you're unmuted.
Yeah, this is a question for both of you. I'm unaware of SDL's I forgot SDL's first name, so I'll just call you SDL. And Pogan. So which one of you has actually like read Marx's Capital, and which volume is your favorite? Thank you.
Oh my god. Yeah, I mean, do either one of you want to answer that question?
I decline to answer on the basis that it's Canadian Catholic.
I've read Volume 1, and I listened to reviews of Volumes 1 and 2. And I've read critiques of all 3. So.
Okay. Fair enough. The next question comes from Doran. He said, for SDL, what are your exact views on gun control? Do you think we need restrictions on what guns can be used, what guns can be used for, and who can buy them, or should we take them away completely?
So the answer that I give is there's a short term and a long term. I think in the long term, I would like a society where there's no widespread civilian household gun ownership. I'm still, this is one of the things that I didn't think would come up very much in this conversation. But in the long run, my vision of society would be one where guns are basically only accessible for hunting purposes at the gun range or in community armories under some sort of like community management. And that's literally just because I think people do worry about like their ability to resist the government. I don't think that guns are an effective way of doing so. However, it'd be nice to give them a way to feel like they are able of doing so without actually increasing their homicide or suicide. So long run is like community armories as the sole place where guns are, basically. In the short run, I think that it's policies like gun licensing, waiting periods. There's something called, I mentioned domestic violence before. It's a long ass name. Domestic violence restraining order gun relinquishment laws. Those are very effective. And then laws about gun safe storage are very, very effective, I think. So those are the main four.
Okay. So next we have a question from, let's see, who's next on the list? We have from another question from Duran for Pogan. Do you think that populism is a good way to achieve communism? I don't know if that's a super related discussion, but if you want to answer the question, then.
Sure. Generally, it seems that populism, populist movements tend to sort of run parallel to like fascistic rhetoric a lot of the time, or at the very least far right rhetoric, things like racism, anti-immigration, general forms of bigotry, opposition to other ethnic groups. But if populism is taken there to just mean like the sort of rhetoric that would be conducive to galvanizing the working class, like general pro-labor statements, being like overly sympathetic to the working class to the point like that's your primary political focus as a candidate, in that case, no. It entirely depends on the sort of rhetoric that the person is employing and what their policies are, as with anything.
All right. So another question for Pogan. I think, they wanted to ask in VC. Oswald Mosley,
Sure.
you're unmuted.
Okay. So my question was for Pogan. Would your views on revolution and gun control remain consistent throughout ideologies? So, for example, do you believe that a fascist uprising should be allowed to be armed, or does it only apply to socialism?
I think obviously an armed fascist uprising would be very bad for the vast majority of people, workers among them. That in and of itself, I don't think is a reason to support gun control as it affects the working class. I think instead, efforts should be taken to move people away from fascistic movements, mainly the dissemination of Marxist propaganda, appealing to them on the basis of like the history of fascist movements, how fascists are ultimately in support of like capitalist interests, those sorts of things. But if the question is just like, if would I support gun control because fascists would have access to guns? The answer is no.
Okay. Thank you, Pogan. Next, we have a question from Kazad. SDL, if revolutionary fear is what motivates capitalists to give concession, then why do we disarm the working class?
Could you repeat the question?
If revolutionary fear is what motivates capitalists to give concessions, then why should we disarm the working class?
Sure. So I think that there's a decent chunk of evidence that capitalists do give more concessions when they're afraid of revolution. The problem is that I don't think that there is a credible threat of revolution anymore. And so I don't know that workers being armed or workers not being armed actually makes much difference in that respect. The only fear that you'd be talking about there is like fear of them getting shot, which is not the same thing as a class revolution. So it's not going to force the capitalist class as a class to give concessions. So I think the answer of what actually motivates capitalists nowadays is the fact that they are a minority within a broader democracy. And so long as the government has the ability to like force wealth to obey, we like the majority of the population, I think by one estimate, the workers make up like 88% of the population and the managerial class like another like 8% or so, right? We make up the enormous majority of the population. If we vote accordingly, if we organize both electorally and in like nonviolent dual actions like strikes and so on, we can force them to heel.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Old Man Vox. He says, if guns are linked to higher rates of suicides, crimes, and deaths, then how do you explain countries with less gun control laws than the US, but super low crime and suicide rates? Because that's for USDL.
Sure. So for that one, it's really hard to compare crime rates across countries. I would appeal to the UN's victim survey, which found that reported rates of being a victim of violent crime are actually not too different across like the United States and these other countries. I think a lot of it has to do with the United States has an enormous carceral system and an enormous like police system. As well, I would just note the United States has a unique war on drugs, which tends to, I think, drive up the like reported crime rate and trap people in lives of violent and nonviolent crime. Also, I think there are actually international comparisons, and they do find that guns correlate with more homicides. So, but it's just correlation, not causation. So, who knows?
Okay. I think Bandit wanted to ask a question in VC. So, Bandit, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. We can hear you.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask you, since one of the tactics that you said was that we should work with liberals, right? To push like I don't know, like conservative workers more to the left on social issues.
Yep.
I don't know why. So at best, what you're gonna gain by working with liberals is, being a token, right? Like that's pretty much it, right? They're gonna get all the praise, right? They're gonna push through all the legislation, and you're just gonna be like a helping hand whom nobody will ever like remember, right? And we know for a fact that like historically, whether it's a revolutionary or reformist movement, they have always been most successful when they organized independently, right, into a party within a labor movement, right? And all the gains, by the way, all the gains that you mentioned here in Europe, in Western democracies, and so on and so forth, they're being kind of cut through austerity in the last 2 decades, slowly, right? The biggest defenders of these and fighters against these cuts were precisely the most revolutionary elements of that society, right? When we look at France, when we look at Britain, when we look at all these other countries, Spain or Greece or all these other countries where you had like these massive, the most radical left-wing elements were defending social democratic gains that were being cut even by, moderate socialists and social democrats.
Sure. So, in particular, I said that we should side with liberals as opposed to trying to peel off a few conservatives. That was the argument that I was trying to make. The argument more generally is that first argument that I made is in the context of like an oncoming capitalist collapse, whether it be from like ecology or something else, it's probably better to get liberals on our side, both by like converting them, doing like entryism, converting them to the left via mass movements. We've seen like in the United States that people have shifted to the left on both social and economic issues in the past like 8 years and even like 16 years. And I think a big part of that is because the left has been willing to work within the Democratic Party, for example, and shift Democrats to the left, shift liberals to the left. So the answer one that I'm giving is like entryism and persuasion. The answer two that I'm giving is sort of the one that you mentioned, that when we pass like left social policy, we can shift workers to the left and make it less likely that conservatives are going to side with out and out fascists. Maybe they'll side with national conservatives or just regular conservatives, but it will be less and less likely for them to side with like proper fascists of the 1930s kind. And that makes it less likely that, do the fascists win, there will be mass killing at least. So that would be nice. I would like to avoid that. That's sort of the argument that I'm trying to raise here. It's about minimizing harm if the fascists do win, and making it more likely that, like, were society to collapse, that liberals will side with the left, both because we'll have this history of working together and because the workers themselves and the vast majority of people will be closer to the values of socialists. If I were going to appeal to one little thing here, it's called I call it policy acquiescence bias. There's a decent chunk of evidence that when the state changes its policies, people change their views to reflect that of the state. So like when gay marriage was passed, people became more accepting of gay marriage. More economically left countries, this one's not as clearly causal, but more economically left countries also have somewhat more economically left citizens after those policies are passed. So in short, I guess the argument that I'm trying to give is like, we work with them to change people's minds, sort of the Frankfurt School style approach. We change the culture, and that makes it more likely that we will win as socialists. There will be more socialists, and so it's more likely that we'll win.
Okay. Next, we'll move on to Squishy, who wanted to ask in VC as well. So, give me a second. There he is. Squishy, you're unmuted.
No, I didn't. I didn't want to ask in VC. I don't even know where my fucking question is anymore. I gotta pull it up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can ask it for you if you want, because I still have it I have it in the text chat.
Squishy's just going to ask you about decoupling or something. It's going to be some incredibly complicated technical question I'm not going to have a great answer for. I guarantee it.
Well, we can find out, right? So his question is, for SDL, earlier you mentioned that market solutions can solve the ecological collapse. The IPCC says that these solutions have not made any sort of substantial impact and that the economic mode of consumption needs to be drastically changed in the next 2 decades. How does the slow roll of reformism address this issue?
Sure. So I think the answer to this one is twofold. One, the slow roll of revolution is better than the non-roll, to my mind, the slow roll of reform is better than the non-roll, the non-movement of revolution. Better to offset the crisis by 20% than by 0. The second answer is that I am generally more optimistic on this, in large part because you can actually literally thank Obama for this. Really heavy U.S. investment into wind and solar enormously dropped the prices of wind and solar, and that in turn enormously made solar more popular in world energy markets. And so what we're seeing now is that like power plants are literally being driven out of business that aren't solar because solar is so much cheaper compared to them. It literally might actually be like on the order of like industrial revolution, but we'll have to see 10 years from now. So I am optimistic on the green growth front because I think that technology is moving in the right direction. The critique that I would raise is called the Lucas critique. The mere fact that we haven't made great progress in the past doesn't mean that we won't make great progress in the future. And in particular, I would just note that there is a decent chunk of evidence. I can send you a paper from, it's literally IMF, but the guy is like a decent author, that there has been decoupling, even when you account for the effects of trade, even when you just look at consumption, which is generally the hard case for decoupling. There's been decoupling or near decoupling in many of the rich countries. Whoever that was, just send me a DM and I'll send you the study.
Okay. So thank you for that. So we have a question from JavaBolt. For Pogan, what, if anything, would make you support gun control?
If there was some knockdown argument to revolution, such that revolution would be impossible in terms of achieving a socialist society, then I would probably advocate for gun control largely on the social health grounds that SDL was articulating. But obviously, not only do I not believe that revolution is impossible, I believe revolution is the more expedient and effective way of establishing socialism as compared to reform. So, I mean, that's a realistic scenario where I could be sympathetic to what he's talking about. I just don't think that's really, I don't think it's going to be very easy to show that revolution is not expedient and efficient.
Okay, thank you, Pogan. So next we had a question from Nyeft. They wanted to ask on VC.
Hi, am I talking?
Yep,
Yeah.
we can hear you loud and clear.
Cool. I'd probably take a somewhat moderated position, so I guess I was going to ask, how do the debaters feel about the idea of moderating between the two positions and possibly finding some means for purity testing for gun ownership? I know it might sound a little bit idealistic, but when I think of like America's culture, I see like a violently individualistic ideological bent to it. Like you get like people to like get away from my garbage bin, and then they shoot each other in Texas, right? And I think we might want to consider social programs and education alongside some kind of moderated position, because I frankly wouldn't want to arm reactionaries. I'd only want to arm revolutionary people if I could help it.
So to speak first, I think the position that I tried to propose is like the gun control proposals I want in the short term are pretty moderate. The long term one is that I don't want household ownership. I want community ownership, because I think that lets you retain all of the strength of the possible revolutionary arguments while also removing most of the strength of the like public health arguments, because most suicides are impulsive. People just grab a gun and kill themselves. There's a whole lot of evidence on that one. And most homicides too are also reasonably impulsive. So just put it in the community armory, a lot less people are going to end up dead with those guns. So I don't know if Pogan's fine with that sort of solution, but that's my take.
What sort of solution?
Community armories as opposed to household gun ownership.
No, I wouldn't. I think that's basically inviting government control of who gets firearms and who doesn't. I don't think there's going to be a realistic way of regulating that at a community level such that the central government wouldn't be involved. So no, I would purely advocate for private ownership of firearms. In essence, like a militia.
Pogan, don't you literally support central planning? How can you be worried about state imposition over firearms, but not about the entire economy?
State imposition within a neoliberal capitalist society. It's not government control simpliciter. It's government control given the current circumstances.
Well, sure, just have it be like a democratic community control. Like you elect the mayor, you elect the gun guy, right? Oh, I'm running for the gun guy job.
Yeah, I mean, look, the point is that person would still, on some level, be subject to the interests of businesses in a neoliberal capitalist society, even if it's on a local level, right? I can't really foresee a situation where the gun control guy who's elected and therefore has to finance a campaign, immediately making him subject to the interests of capitalists, is completely unaffected by the interests of capital, even if it's just small businesses in his immediate area. Did I cut out?
No, I just figured Shiny was going to do the next question.
Oh, okay.
No, okay. I wasn't sure whether you
Thanks,
guys were done or
guys.
not. I was giving it a few seconds. All right. Thank you for the question, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So next we have another question from Old Man Fox. He says, many of the gun control laws most liberals suggest are ones which already exist in the U.S. Can you give an example how increasing a waiting time protects people?
Me?
I guess that's for SDL, yeah.
Oh, sure. That one is just one of the ones where there's a decent chunk of high quality evidence that when you increase waiting periods, the homicide link is way back at the beginning when Mondian brought it up. It's weaker because when you use different methodologies, some find it, some don't. But I think the higher quality methodologies, like the ones that use like difference in difference, do find it generally. So on the homicide one, it just directly protects people because it seems like people don't buy guns impulsively as much when there's a waiting period. Suicide, there's so much stronger evidence that, like, again, you're just preventing impulsive suicides. There was this incredible statistic. This study came out just last month that if you bought a handgun in California, your odds of committing suicide by handgun were roughly 3 in 1,000 over the next 12 years, as compared to around 3 in 10,000, so 10 times less if you hadn't bought a handgun. So like roughly a 10 times increase. I think that, in short, waiting periods seem to just a little bit make suicide less impulsive. There's other limitations, but even those are a good step.
Okay. And he asks another question in kind of the same vein. He says, do you want gun registration? If so, how does that help or save anyone? All that does is makes it easier for the government to take guns away from those who haven't committed crimes. It won't prevent people from illegally getting guns or even the sale of guns from a legal owner to a non-legal owner.
So gun registration, I think, is just somewhat a result of having gun licensing. Gun licensing seems to be pretty effective as well. I understand there's a risk that now, yes, the state can like monitor you and take your guns away. I think this is the argument for like strong community armories and strong local nonviolent mass movement organizations, which can like engage people politically so that they're aware of that. They're able to, like, if you believe that guns are an effective way of fighting back, then you could fight back were tyranny to come in. So that's kind of the answer there. I think that it's sort of like the government has a registry on your car. This doesn't make it very much easier for them to like prevent you from using your car to oppose tyranny. I think that the idea is that I am generally not actually very interventionist on gun control stuff. Like, I don't want state troopers coming to your house to check whether you have a gun safe. I'm much more on the like supply side sort of focus, or like broad policy focus, rather than the state troopers into your house side of things.
Okay. So Danny wanted to ask a question in VC, I think. Wait, is he even still here? No, he might not be in the chat right now, so I'll have to ping him and see if he comes back. But I guess Vox wanted to be unmuted as well to, I guess, follow up on your answers to his questions. So let me unmute him real quick. Vox, you're unmuted.
Hey, I'm tired and a little tipsy, but you know, that's never stopped me before from speaking. So, you stated before that correlation does not equal causation, and I agree. For example, if America suddenly instituted suicide boxes, suicides probably would go up, but the amount of gun suicides would drastically drop because of that. It seems like you're fighting a symptom rather than the actual illness itself. You probably find more productivity if you went after the issues for why people commit suicide and do gun violence, rather than just eliminating guns in the first place. You'd save more lives that way for sure. Also, you said before that the waiting list it prevents people from like having jump decision suicides, which yeah, for that day until you realize like somebody's still going to get the gun and they're still going to have suicidal thoughts that aren't going to get addressed because of the lack of um like social programs to help people who are in that state of mind, especially men. They're still going to have like all that's going to change is they're going to kill themselves in February instead of March, like nothing changes really.
Sure. So on the first one, the correlation, not causation one, that's why specific methodologies, I mentioned difference in difference. Some of these are like technical, so I won't explain them too much, but just looking at correlation can't prove what a policy does. Stuff like differences and differences is trying to suss out what the actual effect of a policy is. And it's too complicated to explain in this conversation. But if you look up like an econometrics course, they'll explain it to you, how it works. For the question of like doing other policies, I say do both. I don't think this is an either or instance. It's either take the guns or solve the underlying problem. It's both. Try to reduce civilian gun ownership. Try to make sure that people who are least likely to be responsible are particularly less likely to have guns, stuff like gun licensing, domestic violence restraining orders, and so on. And also try and attack the underlying causes, right? End the war on drugs, move to rehabilitation, not retribution, and so on. So simultaneously, you're trying to reduce underlying violent crime and reduce the impact of guns in that violent crime. I don't think it's either or, it's both and. And then finally, go ahead.
I don't think it's both and, because by that, you said before that like you agreed that it's not correlation does not equal causation. So why does it need to be both and if guns aren't related to any of these issues? It just so happens to be the tool that is used. It's just a symptom. It's not the actual illness.
Sure. So in the gun control literature, what you're talking about is called the substitution effect. Like if people don't have a gun, will they use something else? The answer is no. Generally, there's a much less than one substitution effect. So for every gun that would be used, you're talking like 0.2 knives used instead. So it's there, but it's not one-to-one. And even where there are substitution effects, they're worse. When people don't use a gun to kill themselves, that reduces their risk of suicide in that event by like 20%. Knives are something like 5 times less lethal than guns. It matters when people substitute.
I understand that people are going to be a lot better at killing themselves with a firearm than anything else. No doubt about it. However, that still doesn't, like, removing all guns would just prevent the success rate of suicides and won't actually help them. And yes, your argument to say, well, let's just remove guns and also do this. This way, the amount of people saved through suicides is even less than just doing one or the other. That's agreeable. However, there are studies that show that the amount of crimes that are prevented while somebody has a firearm is significant, maybe even significant enough to where it's worth the loss of life through successful suicides and not. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. So if Munnerdy, if you're still listening, one of the things that's interesting on this one is that when the studies fail to find a significant impact of guns on crime, this also cuts against the argument that guns are protective against crime. If there's no evidence that guns increase crime, there's also even less evidence that guns prevent crime. The main studies that people refer to here are surveys by CLEC or a survey by the CDC. The basic problem of both of them is that about 1% of people say they used guns defensively. And then from that, you assume that 1% of people each year are using guns defensively. You can't do that because of how small the proportion here is and the fact that it's not validated. A much better study, and this is sort of like a methodology thing, so it's complicated. I can send you this in DMs. A much better study, because it has validated victims of crime, is the National Crime Victimization Survey. It literally asks people who were victims of crime, did you use a gun to defend themselves? And again, only about 1% of people say that they used the gun. So rather than thinking about it as 1% of Americans use a gun in self-defense, it's 1% of victims of crime use a gun in self-defense. And that makes the number of guns used enormously lower than the amount of crimes committed with a gun.
Thank you for your answer, STL. Thank you for the series of questions, Vox. Dog says that he has a question. Hopefully it's not a troll question. Dog, you're unmuted.
We need more questions for Pogan. I'm getting all the questions.
I'm about
Dog
ready to
there?
take a nap, bro.
Mm-hmm.
We have like 9 minutes left. Is Dog even there?
So my
I
question
can't-
for Pogan
Thank God.
Socialism Done Left are
Fuck.
how they solve the economic calculation and the local knowledge problem? Do they think it's a problem for communism or socialism or whatever system they advocate for, and how they would solve that?
Well,
Do you want to go first, SDL?
So my answer is that I am a partial market socialist. The inspiration of I think that, in short, markets don't need to fully solve the economic calculation problem or local knowledge problem because they do still maintain competition among firms. The goal is to maintain that while also destroying the capitalist class. That's the very short answer. I kind of came from the langue learner model. So this might be what Pogan talks about. The langue learner model basically says, hey, we'll have a market for final goods. That lets us know what the price of goods should be, which solves part of the economic calculation problem. And then from those prices, we plan everything backwards. It's like a very classic model by a guy who's very famous in matrix mathematics. I'll leave it to Pogan. He might give the cockshot answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say. There's a great paper by Alan Cottrell and Paul Cockshott, who also wrote a book called Towards a New Socialism, called Is Economic Planning Hypercomputational? And then the subtitle has to do with Cantor diagonalization. I can link the paper in debate discussion chat. But that paper not only presents a simulated market within a centrally planned economy per the Lang model, it pretty effectively shows that the economic calculation problem doesn't pose a significant risk to efficiency within a centrally planned economy. I can post that paper right now.
I do want to note, Cockshott and Cottrell believe in labor theory value planning, so they don't have that final market. The Lang model does have a final market, which is why it's usually classed as market socialism, just a very, very planning side one. Cockshott has no market.
Okay. So the next question comes from Java Bolt. It's another question for Pogan. He asks, how would you safeguard a revolution from revolutionaries that don't care about establishing socialism, but instead take advantage of their new positions of power?
I mean, that's the sort of thing that's going to be addressed by achieving sufficient class consciousness. The whole idea is if they're members of the revolutionary movement, they're already, for lack of a better term, sold on the idea of socialism, and they're supportive of the cause, insofar as preventing them from, like, seizing undue power after socialism is to be established. I think that would be resolved in much the same way you would pose a threat of power control to capitalists, which is just to say, if there's any sort of political body or political entity not acting in the interests of workers, such that it becomes a situation like the Soviet Union or Maoist China, workers, primarily because they own firearms, absolutely have the means and the ability to overthrow such a political apparatus and establish a society more conducive to their needs.
Okay. So Doran actually said they had another question that they want to VC this time. So, Doran, you're unmuted.
All right. So this question is for Socialism Done Left.
Oh, no.
So I was wondering if tomorrow, if there was a revolution tomorrow of grand scale in the United States, if that happened tomorrow, would you still believe that reform is better than revolution? And if so, why? And do you think that the size of the revolution would not matter in that context? The only thing that matters is that, in your view, reform will be a more effective way than revolution, regardless of what happens?
I'm not sure I understood the precise question.
My question is, do you think that no matter the case, that reform would be the only viable way for leftism to be the end goal?
I don't think that reform is the only viable way. I think that within the current context of the United States, it is the only viable way. In the context of like where a revolution would be likely to happen in the first place, revolution might be more likely to succeed because you're talking about places where the state has collapsed and people have lost the things which make them non-revolutionary, which keep them classified. This would also require like an enormous level of economic destruction, which I don't think is very likely to happen and probably is not a good thing to look forward to.
All right, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Doran. So we have a few more minutes left here. Squishy wanted me to relay a message for him to you, SDL. He wanted me to yell it, but I'm not very good at yelling, so you'll just have to use your imagination. Imagine I'm yelling this. They said, how the fuck do you decouple fossil fuels with our current technology of renewable energies, for one, without a huge, massive revolutionary shift towards nuclear power, which has insane costs and long-term issues, or two, making these renewable energies appear from thin air? You're kicking the can down the road by cost shifting, and the idea of relying on some science fiction of the future is not an answer. So that's, imagine that I just yelled that.
Oh no, I'm deeply upset that you didn't. So Squishy, right?
Yes, that was from Squishy.
So this is a conversation I think that we've had like before. I am like more optimistic, and you are pessimistic on green growth. Of course, you call yourself realistic, and I'm optimistic. Whatever, the terms are unimportant. I think that we're already seeing decoupling occur. We're already seeing what's called like elasticity. We're starting to see negative elasticity of growth with respect to carbon, even for consumption-based trade inclusion metrics. So we're already, in fact, starting to see it. That's my first position, and that a big part of that is due to the enormous reduction of price of solar. So I do think it's partially kicking the can down the road because we're just relying on the market to shift its production, right? I think that green growth under capitalism it might solve climate change, but it might not. It's like a risky endeavor. That's why I want reformist, center left at worst and like left at best governments to aggressively pursue a socialist central planning style industrial policy to decarbonify the economy. I pointed before to the Lee Phillips article on decoupling and degrowth. And one of the big things that they point to there is that within the order of like 20 years, France rapidly decarbonified. I think that it was like each year, 4.5% reduction of carbon emissions because of the rate at which they were building nuclear power plants. So I think that the solution is that markets might solve it. They might be fast enough, but the state should very much so encourage them to move much, much, much faster. As for like the long-term problems of nuclear, I think that that's more a complicated one, but I generally think that they are much overblown as compared to like existing alternative technologies.
All right, thank you. And since we only have a couple more minutes left, we'll end off with one more question. This isn't, I guess, strictly related to the topic of debate tonight, but since you guys are both socialists, Concrete Plus wanted to know what problems you guys are looking to have solved by socialism that aren't solved by capitalism.
The existence of capitalists.
Yeah, I mean, basically, right? STL and I are going to agree on this at the very least. The existence of a capitalist class in the first place, and by extension, the sort of labor exploitation that is necessitated by their existence in order for them to profit, seems like the fundamental. I mean, that's the crux of Marx's critique of capitalism in the first place.
I think the four answers I usually say are: I want more full political democracy. You can't have that when a whole bunch of wealth, and wealth is power, is concentrated among a few people. I want workplace democracy. Hard to have that under capitalism. It's easier to have it with a very supportive government, supports unions and cooperatives. I want much less inequality and like the abolition of the capitalist class. And I also want like macroeconomic or investment democracy. I want the people to decide like where the economy as a whole is moving, for example, on environmental issues, as opposed to just where the market wants it to move. So I think socialism performs better in each of those four areas.
Well, thank you guys both. It's now 10 o'clock. We've been doing this for 2 hours, so we're just about ready to wrap up. I want to thank you guys both for coming and doing this. This has been really fun. Hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. And I want to thank everyone else in the audience for coming as well. For those who are new here, we're going to have more events like this coming up, debates, AMAs, seminars, and stuff. So hopefully you stick around. You have a good community here. And for anybody who might be watching on YouTube or something, feel free to swing by the server if you're not here already, because it's nice. I don't know.
Amazing.
Do you guys want to? Either you guys want to say anything before we?
Yeah, I want to make a quick comment. We got a little heated in the discussion tonight, SDL, but if you ever want to talk about anything, either in a debate format or just a discussion format, you know where to find me. I have no problem with that whatsoever.
I don't talk to libs, so sorry, Pogan. But I'd be happy to reach out. And Shiny, your server's decent, okay? But it ain't as good as DDL, okay? Discord down left, maybe.
Well, we can't always, we can't all be the best, right? We can only be one. So,
no, thanks again for hosting.
Yeah, anytime you guys want to do any other thing like this, like either one of you, I'm always down to host. So, feel free to reach out. Love you guys both.
Oh, thanks, Shiny.